and welcome to the debate on FR24. I'm Andrea Sankey in Paris. Tonight, Algeria under attack. A wave of terrorist bombings over the past week has made it clear that Algerian authorities are far from winning their own war on terror. 5 attacks in 5 days have prompted France's foreign minister to label Algeria a dangerous country. And some foreign workers have been repatriated for safety reasons. Now, it's believed the attacks have all been perpetrated by Islamic militants, most likely associated with the former Salafist group for preaching in combat, now recognized as Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb. They last created horror in December after a double car bomb attack on UN offices in Algiers killed 41 people, including 17 United Nations employees. So, has Algeria made any progress fighting extremists on their own territory? How much sympathy is there for Islamists in Algeria? And how much is at stake internationally if Algeria fails to defeat Al-Qaeda? Well, joining me tonight to discuss those questions and others, here in the studio to my left, Boubekeur, leader of the Islam and Europe program at the Center for European Policy Studies. Here to my right, Douglas Yates, professor of political science at the American University of Paris. Joining us via satellite from Fort Lauderdale in Florida, Walid Fares, research fellow from the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. And on the phone from Oxford, Dr. James McDougall, a modern and contemporary North Africa specialist from the School of Oriental and African Studies. Thanks all so much for joining us tonight. Let me start here in the studio to my left. Amel, at one point, Algeria did claim to be very close to actually eliminating extremism in Algeria, and yet in the last 2 years now, there's actually been a serious resurgence. Why is Algeria losing this war?
You know, they have been successful in undermining the popular support for extremism and Islamism and a certain form of Salafism. So that's a victory. But still, indeed, they have terrorist attacks. Often, they are not able to counter it, and nobody is really willing to have a final statement or final idea of who is committing these attacks. It's all reported to Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, but still, the difference and the boundaries between the old GSPC, new recruits or new people from the Algerian youth and Al-Qaeda as such is still unclear.
Do you have your doubts then? The way it's purported, particularly in the international press, is that Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb is responsible for all of these attacks. You don't think that's the case? I
think a part of the Algerian youth is indeed fascinated by, the ideology and the utopia proposed by Al-Qaeda. September 11 and the war in Iraq have been major events which have reoriented the way young Algerians think about themselves and jihad in Algeria.
Okay. James McDougall joining us from Oxford. Let me get your opinion. Why is Algeria losing this war? And why did it seem to be winning at one point only to face a resurgence just a few years later?
Well, I'm not sure that I would agree that Algeria is losing the war. I think we need to distinguish between what happened in the 1990s and what's happening now. I think fundamentally Algeria, the Algerian state, that is, won the war that began in 1992. And which continued with increasing levels of violence into the mid to late 1990s, and then significantly, effectively ended around between 1999 and 2004 during the first presidential mandate of Abdelaziz Bouteflika, the current president. What's happening now is, some people might assume that this is kind of an epilogue to that violence, and some people might suggest that it's the beginning of something quite different since the rebranding of the former GSPC as Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb last year. But what seems to be happening now is that in response to the fact that the real underlying causes of the violence in the 1990s weren't resolved, there has been an upswing of violence in the country, which never really went away. But I think the configurations of the violence are not the same as they were now. The political stakes behind the violence are certainly not the same as they were in the early 1990s. This is, to a large extent, I think what's going on now is a product of the failure locally and domestically to solve real political and economic problems, to respond to social grievances, and also, of course, a product of an international, global, and regional climate of hostility, of clash of civilizations rhetoric, of the war on terror, of responses to the war in Iraq, and so on.
Okay, Douglas.
Well, I think Amel and James have both raised an important point, and that is what might be perceived as terrorism in Algeria might also be perceived as a larger movement that's being globalized through communication networks, through organizations, into an identity struggle. So I think one way to look at this is an identity struggle. But another part of me has always looked at the Algerian conflict as one that is based on resources, on a state that relies extensively on oil rents. That is the theory of the rentier state. And this raises theories like greed and grievance and the notion of what, the way that oil plays into this. Is it a coincidence that oil is hitting new records at the same time that the subaltern groups are making record terrorist attacks? We don't know.
Okay, let me get Walid's point first, and then Amel will come back to you.
Well, there's certainly the fact that two parameters are still the same, and others have evolved from the conflict in the 90s with mostly the Salafi group and their allies. Number one, the ideology. We seldom talk about the ideology. Yes, the Algerian state was able, in the 90s and beyond, to defeat the organization. It was not able to defeat, to limit, to create an alternative, ideological alternative, counter-takfiri, meaning counter-radicalization process successfully. So what happens now is that a second generation of these jihadist Salafists have been rising in Algeria. And yes, they do connect with the mothership, Al-Qaeda, but also they react to the international context. My point here, Andrea, is that there are two major reasons for what we see. One is domestic, meaning the Salafi jihadi ideology is not done yet. The society has to deal with that. And two, let's keep in mind that there is today, unlike in the 90s, an international organization. We need to connect the events in Algeria to those attacks in Morocco, in Mauritania, Chad, and Somalia. There is this whole area, the Sahara, which seems to be on the international level. And the Algerian branch of jihadism is only one part of it. The next target after the containment that has taken place in Iraq and in Afghanistan. So one would also look at the international strategy of Al-Qaeda, which this group in North Africa is only part of.
Walid, let me just ask you quickly to give us an idea then, in the context strictly of the Maghreb, just how strong are Islamic extremists in Algeria?
Look, they have not been defeated ideologically, which means that those who seized the fight against the state in the 90s and just before a few years ago, some of them have entered the political process. Others have not. So you don't need really a large number of Salafi combat jihadists to perform what they have been performing over the past few days or over the past few months. So it's a smaller size organization which is doing things that reminds us of what has been happening in Iraq and in other parts of the Middle East. International jihadism is happening now because they have attacked the United Nations. They are targeting, of course, as the gentleman has mentioned, some of the installations very close to oil systems in Algeria. So there is another dimension with the same clientele, the same market of jihadism in Algeria.
Right. Amel, let me ask you a question, if we can, to clarify some of the fundamentals here. Whom exactly are the Salafists or Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb targeting in Algeria?
Well, basically state interests primarily, but also all those who they consider as being Hizb Fransa, I mean, sons of France or sons of Crossers, or, So they have all this post-colonial imaginary, and they consider that they have issued a fatwa in the 90s, which excommunicated all Algerians. So we have seen the shift from an anti-state jihad, to a jihad against the population as a whole. So But still, it's interesting to see that the generation has changed. I mean, people who are now fighting in the frame of Al-Qaeda in Algeria are not the same as the people who were fighting in the frame of the GSPC in the 90s. I spoke about the fascination for the Iraq War and the silver screen, gun culture, which is some way is happening also to some part of the Algerian youth. And we also have to remind that since 2002, Algeria is still under the state of emergency, and there's no political channel able to or political alternative able to channel the violence and the frustration of the Algerian youth.
Mm-hmm. Douglas, let me ask you. I mean, do you think the government could be doing, not only a better job of fighting extremists then, but obviously of winning over those who may sympathize with them, or at least, if not sympathize, just be indifferent to perhaps their presence?
I think that whenever you have what we call terrorism, it's an analytical category that is too broad. It's overextensive. And normally what we try to do is we try to identify what are the causes or the sources, and then from the perspective of government, try to decide how we can rectify these. So, for example, the FLN, which is now the government, 50 years ago was a terrorist organization. It was doing much the same thing, exploding car bombs, killing supposedly innocent Western people who were just doing engineering and working in the oil industry. And now they find themselves as a comprador government. That is a government that serves to coordinate the expropriation of the natural resources of Algeria for the consumption of Europeans. And in this position, they collaborate largely with the Western oil companies, with the European oil companies. So the FLN had started as a terrorist organization that was fighting this struggle and became co-opted and largely became a partner of Europe. And so what you have here is, in a sense, the new FLN. And so to ask the question, what should the government do, we could step back and reason by analogy to what should France have done. Some people will say, well, France shouldn't have done anything. They couldn't do anything. Algerian independence was inevitable. But there are others who say, well, no, it wasn't inevitable, and France still has Guyana and Tahiti, and France perhaps could have held on to Algeria the way it held on to Corsica or the Basque region, despite the presence of terrorists and strong independence movements. But it didn't, because it failed to address the root causes. And the root causes were largely the unfair distribution of oil revenue and natural resource revenue. So certainly if the Algerian government was to get involved with poverty alleviation rather than making the already rich and privileged FLN ruling elite, sometimes 2 or 3 generations of rule within the same family, even richer. And they started, which they haven't done for 20 years, to channel some of their oil revenues into poverty alleviation. There'd be less support for these kinds of movements.
Okay. Walid, I'm not sure if I detected some disagreement on your face there, but go ahead.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Well, it's basically an analytical disagreement. Unfortunately, I think on both sides of the Atlantic, we have 2 schools that looks at the jihadist movement and then make conclusions. One, the traditional, I would say, is liberal, Marxist, or even conservative, saying that they are frustrated because of disenfranchisement, meaning if the government have a better distribution of wealth, then you won't find a jihadist movement. I sort of disagree with that, because to create a jihadist movement or individuals, these are not people coming out of the classroom or graduate studies and encouraging other peasants, as was the case during the Algerian Revolution, who at the time had a liberation cause. I mean, what did the FLN had as an objective during the war against the French? Is to get the French out and to establish an Algerian state which was socialist. What is the objective of the Salafists? This is the missing link in our analysis. We avoid analyzing the fact that the Salafist combat and others, including Al-Qaeda and even post-Al-Qaeda, wants to establish an emirate with oil. I mean, the Salafists who are fighting today, if they take over the regime, they're going to be, yes, another FLN in the sense that they're going to control these richness. And I'm not sure, as the Taliban have done or the Islamic court in Somalia have tried to do, they will distribute also the wealth. There is a difference, in my sense, between the economic analysis and between the ideological analysis. And I think we should put more stress on the ideological one, because to become a jihadist, you need to go through an indoctrination process through which you begin to see the world the relationship with the government, the relationship with the French, and with the other parts of society. Remember, and I conclude here, in the 90s, those who have suffered mostly from the Salafists were the Algerian people, were rock stars, were journalists, were secular people, and today the target is the Algerian state. So there is a continuation on the ideological level.
Okay. Walid, you will have the last word for this half of the debate. Unfortunately, we need to take a 12-minute break now for news and weather, but we will continue this discussion after that time, and all our panelists return, so do stay with us. Welcome back to the debate on France 24, where we have been discussing the recent terrorist attacks in Algeria and how the country is fighting extremists. And joining me again to continue that discussion here in the studio to my left, I'm Boubekeur, leader of the Islam in Europe program at the Center for European Policy Studies. Here to my right, Douglas Yates, professor of political science at the American University of Paris. Joining us via satellite from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, Walid Fares, research fellow from the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. And on the phone from Oxford, England, Dr. James McDougall, a modern and contemporary North Africa specialist from the School of Oriental and African Studies. Thanks all so much for joining us again. James, as you remember before we went to break, I had asked Douglas originally if the government could be doing a better job of winning over those who may sympathize with the extremists in Algeria, or at least just prove indifferent to them. You had a comment on that question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, I think that, again, there's a difference between what was going on in the 90s and what's happening now. I want to come back on something that Douglas said, which is, to go back in history and kind of suggest that, the Islamists now, whatever they call themselves, the GSPC or Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, are in a sense the new FLN. Or indeed, that they're sort of the new FIS, the New Islamic Salvation Front, the political party that won the elections in 1992. I don't think that's the case at all. I mean, I don't think that, the Islamists were ever a new FLN in terms of simply using violence to gain political power and then hold on to it. And even less is that the case now than it was in the early 90s. Now, it is true that there was a political movement in the early 90s, a social movement, a genuinely, to a certain extent, popular social movement with a real political project, a real ideology. A certain idea of what they wanted to do with the state, but that was never an ideology that had the assent of the great majority of the Algerian population. You have to remember that fewer than a quarter of those who voted in that election in 1992 actually supported the Islamists, and their support in the population as a whole was never absolutely overwhelming. It's certainly even less now than it was then. So in terms of what the government can be doing to win over people who support Islamism, we have to ask what it is that people actually support when they apparently support Islamism. I don't think it's the case that there's a real political agenda here, as Walid Fares suggested, that there's an attempt here to be building an Islamic caliphate. I don't think they're at all that coherent politically. There is no political agenda now, even less than there was in the 90s. In the 90s, it was largely a protest vote against what was perceived to be an authoritarian, corrupt, inefficient state. Now it's much more a kind of global ideological movement feeding on local political, social, economic dissatisfaction, and with a real kind of cultural sort of twist to it, that people are seeking self-realization in a kind of movement that promises them something which is culturally valorized, martyrdom, or sacrifice in the cause of a jihad for the sake of God, for the sake of true belief, for the sake of religion, for the sake of making society better.
Okay.
In the absence of any real political agenda.
Okay, Amal, go ahead.
Yeah, you have two ways to understand what is currently occurring in Algeria. Either you take the ideological option, and then you just think that the new Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb is an organization which is convinced by a jihadi ideology and so on. And it's interesting to see that the Algerian government tried to promote or to counter this ideology in using the Salafiyya Dawa, which is the peaceful option of the Salafiyya in Algeria. And this movement is booming actually in Algeria because people are just being deceived by and disappointed followed by the use of violence, and then they turned to a more peaceful form of Salafism. But it failed. I mean, they invited, Salafi shuyukh in order to promote fatwa, condoning violence, and so on. It failed because we still have a number of attacks. And then you have the second option. Understanding this phenomenon has the fact that violence became the only tool for political negotiation in Algeria since 1992. And it's quite relevant to see that those young who are joining Al-Qaeda, are totally ignorant of what the political content of the state is. They are just, willing to be active. I would say, maybe to sum up, that the process, being a jihadi, is more important than the project, establishing an Islamic State, as it was the case in the 90s. So being a jihadi now is really the thing.
Okay, let me ask you a question that really has more to do with the, logistics of this battle between the Algerian authorities and the extremists in the country. Where are the extremists actually hiding? Do they have a safe haven of sorts in Algeria?
Well, yeah, they are in the Boubekeur region, around Algiers also, and it's not important to know where they are, because I think the Algerian army obviously know where they are, but how young people from civil society can join them. And I had some interviews in the ground, and I interviewed some young Algerians who joined Al-Qaeda just because they were, they were unemployed, because they haven't found any other alternative to be heard. We have violence each day now in Algeria. Violence is not occurring solely under the manifestation or the jihadi act. We have riots, for example, in the south of Algeria almost each day now. So violence has become a really important tool for political negotiation. And what the Algerian government should do is trying to open the political field in order to provide alternative ways to be in negotiation with him.
Okay, but Walid, you still don't see this as a matter of, disillusioned youth. These are genuine jihadist-minded people that are fighting for this. It's not just a question of lowering unemployment, increasing education.
It always begins somewhere. The Weimar Republic was not about National Socialism at all, but then you had an organized group which took the advantage of the socio-economic collapse of that republic, and the rest is history as we know it. There is a difference, Andrea, between why they join. Why they join, there's a million reasons. Frustration, parents have divorced, foreign policy inacceptance, economic disarray. But once they join, the game is different. Once they join, the radicalization, the ideology becomes the inspirer. And if there is an organization, of course, it becomes even more disciplined. Let me summarize quickly that we are dealing with different levels here. There is a Berber problem with the government on the issue of identity, Arab identity and what have you. So that's one thing. There is a opposition which is left-wing, liberal, Marxist, socialist, also has a problem with the government on a variety of issues that my colleagues have mentioned. There is also a political problem between the Islamist movement, the inheritance, the heirs of the FIS, Front de Salut Islamique, of the 90s, I'm not talking about the GIA, who still exists and who also engage the government, not in violence, but in political tensions. And it's only the last player, the jihadists who have inherited the GIA and inherited or part of the Salafi group of combat, those have a specific problem with all of the ones I have mentioned. I don't think that the jihadists today in Algeria are very friendly with the Berbers. Actually, the number of people killed in the Kabyle and other areas, including the most secular individuals and artists, and the list is very long, are Berbers. Well, and I don't think that there will be a unity of action between the jihadists and the left-wing liberal movement. We meet them every day in Europe and elsewhere. This is not what they want to establish.
If I may,
the government, if I may say one thing.
Yeah, sure. No, I would like to say
that the government has to do one thing. It has to create a national unity of all except the terrorists, including the Islamists. Meaning the Islamist political parties who are not violent should be part of the process with the government, with the Berbers, with the liberal movement to isolate the most radicals. That's the way that the government should do. Unfortunately, I agree with my colleagues. The government has not been doing a great job in this regard.
Quickly, Amel, and then we'll go on to another issue.
No, just a quick fact that it's true that the use of Arabic was circularized in the jihadi videos that you can find on the Al-Qaeda website, Algerian Al-Qaeda website, and so on. But now they are even promoting videos using the Berberian dialect. So these all old boundaries between, Berberian, Islamist, legalized Islamist, the FIS, Salafi, and so on are disappearing and are just leaving the place for the use of violence as a political tool for negotiation.
Okay.
Yeah, can I just say just very quickly?
Go ahead, James.
On this, thanks. I think Amel's absolutely right that what's important in terms of becoming jihadi, it's the process is significant, not the project, because there really is no project. But I can't agree with Walid Faris, that the government ought to have a broad church national coalition government and exclude everybody but the terrorists. I mean, they're effectively already doing that. There is one Islamist party. The Social Movement for Peace, Hamas, which is part of what's called the presidential coalition in Algeria. There are three parties that divided up between themselves the majority seats in the parliament at the last legislative elections last year. And there is an Islamist party which is in that coalition. So there are certainly parts of the Algerian ruling elite faction which expresses itself in Islamist terms within the system, not in terms of violence and so on. The problem is that below that factional political class that runs the country under all its ideological colours, from the Trotskyists on the left right through to the conservative Islamists on the right, with the FLN in the middle. You also have a mass of society which sees itself totally disenfranchised and dispossessed of any actual purchase on what's going on in their country, and that's what feeds this continually kind of simmering violence.
Okay. If you don't mind at this point, I'd like to switch gears. Walid, let me first direct this question to you. Algeria is, of course, an OPEC member and a major oil and gas exporter. So do you think the world should actually fear a flourishing, terrorist network there, especially considering where oil prices are at today? If one more supplier is threatened with instability, what happens?
Well, basically, that is what's happening in the region as a whole. That's why I mentioned in the beginning of our discussion that behind and beyond the local claim by local people in Algeria, you have a strategy by the global jihadist movement, part of which is Al-Qaeda, but there are other parts, which basically is to disturb the economic political process of Algeria and in Algeria, because it will have an impact on Europe, an impact on other democracies, all the way to Japan and China. Link this to the statements made by Ahmadinejad. Has nothing to do with the Salafis of Algeria. But there is a stress that by disorganizing or by destabilizing the flow of oil, a cheap flow of oil, there will be a change in international relations. There will be a rearrangement of alliances. I do believe that there is a political intelligence behind the attacks against the old structure in Algeria and elsewhere. It's not just random.
Mm-hmm. Douglas, would you agree?
Oh, well, I mean, I would make a different comment from what he made, but I would agree with what he said there, that I think there is a global strategy. What's interesting, perhaps even ironic, is 40 years ago, Algeria was radical and trying to push oil prices high, and now this very same government is arch-conservative and would like to maintain stable oil prices. It's acting in many ways like a Gulf emirate already. I think that $140 a barrel should ideally allow the Algerian government to be pursuing a variety of programs. But when you look, what you've got is a government that after 50 years of receiving the rents of oil still has no real program for the future of Algeria. Except for producing gas, Algeria is not on any plan to make any industry, to produce any manufacturing projects, to push into the information age. It's not pursuing a green revolution. The only plan of the FLN government is to sell more of their non-renewable resources and appropriate the revenue for themselves.
Go ahead, Emma.
Yeah, no, I would just like to underline that violence and terrorism has never been an obstacle for people to get into Algeria and trying to make business in the oil business. Since the violence began, I mean, Algeria has always exported its oil and gas. But the thing, so I'm not worried about the fact that terrorism could be an obstacle to this business. But still, what is interesting is that violence has even consolidated the Algerian state and its business with regard to all, especially with the U.S. The fact that Algiers has recently refused to the U.S. to be based in Algeria for instaurating the AFRICOM, the African Commandment of the American Army Forces, is the sign that Algeria is not quite worried about the way it could still exported oil and gas. I mean, that's not, jihadism is not a real obstacle to that.
Okay. Down to our last few minutes. James McDougall, let me ask you something interesting to note, actually, in the wake of these latest attacks in Algeria, is the response that prompted from Iran. Iran condemned these attacks and is now calling for a united strategy in combating terrorism. And just a brief quote from Mohammad Ali Hosseini, who is Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson. He said, "The world should stay united and refrain from double standards when dealing with terrorism." What does that really equate to have some kind of call for unification from a country like Iran in the wake of these attacks in Algeria?
Well, goodness knows what he meant by it. I'm sure there was some diplomatic coding going on there. This question of in terms of no double standards. I mean, I do come back to what Walid Faddis talked about earlier in terms of what he called the containment of Islamism in Afghanistan and Iraq. I would argue that what we've had is exactly the opposite of that. In fact, that the war on Iraq and in Afghanistan as well, but especially the war in Iraq and widespread popular outrage about that in the Arab world actually gave one of the significant factors in contributing to this violence in Algeria, which had basically wound down well before 9/11, well before 2003, and which has been given a shot in the arm by the global and geopolitical context since then. I'm also not sure about this question of, a global strategy for the destabilization of the oil price. Certainly the Algerian government is very happy when oil prices are high, and certainly Douglas is quite right to suggest that, this ought to be a means for Algeria to redistribute more effectively its wealth. Certainly the Algerian government in the past has tried to do that, and the Algerian government more recently, since Abdelaziz Bouteflika came to power, has relaunched some of its developmental aspects, investing in infrastructure, investing in the manufacturing sector, investing in agriculture. Those sorts of things have been happening. Not very efficiently, certainly, and certainly to the advantage of a small elite. But as I said before, it's much more the general sense of disenfranchisement that feeds this.
James McDougall, you will have the last word. Unfortunately, we are now completely out of time for this edition of the debate. I'd like to thank our panelists so much for joining us. Emil Boubekeur, Douglas Yates, Walid Faddis, James McDougall. Very much appreciated. That is all for tonight's edition. Another edition then tomorrow. Do join us then. Bonsoir.